Abandoned and alone, a former employee's medical records surface years later in a prestigious hospital, revealing truths that wealth tried to bury. Within sterile corridors and luxury offices, evidence emerges that will shake a powerful family's foundation. Between past decisions and present revelations lies a story that proves some debts demand repayment. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The chipped paint of Alara's apartment felt as cold as her heart. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight slicing through the grimy window, illuminating the meager contents of her life. A paint-splattered easel, a half-finished canvas depicting a stormy sea, and a scattering of canvases piled haphazardly in the corner. Years of struggle had etched themselves onto her face, lines bracketing her weary eyes. A sigh escaped her lips, a sound as brittle as dried leaves. She traced the faded edges of the medical records, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the drabness of her surroundings. A gentle knock echoed through the silence. Alara's neighbor, Ben, a man whose quiet kindness was a balm to her solitude, stood in the doorway, a steaming mug in his hand. "Tea," he offered, his voice soft. "Thank you, Ben," she whispered, accepting the mug. The warmth of the ceramic against her fingers was a small comfort. "These records, they're from Blackwood Hospital." Her voice trembled, barely audible above the hum of the city outside. "Blackwood," Ben's brow furrowed. "That's prestigious, isn't it? What's in them?" Alara hesitated, the weight of the past heavy on her chest. "It's me, my childhood, but it's different. Things are missing, or changed." She opened the file, revealing a series of entries detailing childhood illnesses, but the descriptions were vague, the details obscured. The stark entries hinted at a neglect that chilled her to the bone. The word Blackwood appeared again and again, not just as the location of her treatment but as a recurring name, linked to significant but redacted events. She felt a growing unease, a creeping dread replacing the initial flicker of hope. The tea grew cold in her hand. The warmth didn't reach her anymore. Ben leaned closer, his concern etched on his kind face. The aroma of Earl Grey filled the small apartment, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear clinging to Alara. "Missing details? Like what?" Alara shivered, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The worn fabric offered little warmth against the icy dread that had settled in her bones. Dates are wrong, treatments are vague, and there are gaps, entire sections blacked out. It's like someone scrubbed away parts of my history. She pointed a trembling finger at a particular entry. "This one. It says incident involving Blackwood family member, but the rest is redacted, completely gone." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to amplify the silence that followed. Ben's gaze was intense, his worry palpable. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before gently resting on top. His touch was a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her fear. "Alara," he said softly, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm raging inside her. This is serious. You need to find out what happened." He squeezed her hand, offering silent reassurance. The faint city lights outside cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. The chipped paint on the wall seemed to mock her vulnerability, a stark reminder of her years of struggle. But in Ben's eyes, she saw something else, a hope, a belief in her strength, even when she herself doubted it. I don't know where to start," she whispered, the weight of the task crushing her. "We'll figure it out together," Ben said, his voice firm. "We'll find out what happened to you, Alara. We'll uncover the truth." His unwavering support was a small flame in the encroaching darkness. He stood, a silent promise in his posture. "I'll help you." The next morning, the city woke to a gray, damp chill. Alara, however, felt a different kind of cold, the icy grip of fear that clung to her like a second skin. Ben's reassurance, the warmth of his hand, felt like a distant memory. The apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt claustrophobic. She stared at the medical records, the redacted sections mocking her. The smell of burnt coffee, a testament to her sleepless night, filled the air, bitter and acrid, mirroring her mood. "Maybe it's nothing," she muttered, the words hollow even to her own ears. But a knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The incident, the gaps, it felt too deliberate, too calculated to be a simple oversight. Ben arrived with pastries, their sweet aroma a fleeting distraction from the looming dread. He studied her face, his concern palpable. "Slept at all?" Alara shook her head. "I keep replaying it in my head, Ben. The way it's redacted, like they're hiding something terrible." "We'll find out," Ben said, his voice firm. Yet a tremor ran through his normally steady hands as he placed the pastries on the table. His touch was gentle, comforting, but Alara noticed the slight tremble. He was scared too. "I need to go to Blackwood Hospital," Alara declared, her voice stronger than she felt. The thought of confronting the imposing building filled her with trepidation, but the need to confront her past overshadowed her fear. Ben nodded, his eyes reflecting her determination. "I'll come with you." He squeezed her hand again, his touch a silent promise of support in the face of the unknown. As they stepped out into the city's dreary embrace, Alara felt a flicker of hope amidst the chilling fear. The fight for her past, for the truth, had begun. The pastries lay untouched on the table, a forgotten offering in the face of a battle yet to be fought. The imposing gray stone of Blackwood Hospital loomed before them, a silent giant radiating an air of sterile authority. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the city's grim light in shimmering streaks. Alara felt a tremor run through her, a physical manifestation of her fear. The scent of damp earth and exhaust fumes mingled with the faint, antiseptic smell carried on the wind from the hospital. Ben's hand, warm and reassuring, squeezed hers. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the turbulent storm raging within Alara. She swallowed, the dryness in her throat a physical manifestation of her anxiety. "As I'll ever be," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum. The hospital's grand entrance, a cavernous space of polished marble and hushed tones, felt oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something subtly metallic like old blood. A receptionist, her face etched with weary indifference, directed them to the medical records department. The waiting room was sparsely furnished, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock. Each tick felt like a hammer blow against Alara's already frayed nerves. Ben tried to make light conversation, but his words felt forced, hollow. His concern was etched onto his face, mirrored in the worried lines that creased his brow. Finally, a nurse, her expression as cold as the room, led them to a small office. The air here was different, colder, heavy with the weight of untold secrets. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight piercing the gloom. On the desk lay a file, Alara's file, a tangible representation of her buried past. The nurse placed it on the desk with a perfunctory gesture and left, leaving Alara and Ben in a suffocating silence. Alara's fingers trembled as she reached for the file. She felt Ben's hand on her shoulder, a silent offering of support. Opening the file, she saw the familiar, yet horrifying, details of her childhood. A chilling reminder of the years stolen from her, years of pain and neglect concealed behind the Blackwood family's gilded facade. The redacted sections gaped like accusing eyes, promising a deeper darkness yet to be revealed. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just a search for information anymore. It was a confrontation with a past she desperately tried to forget. The fight had truly begun. The file felt brittle under Alara's trembling fingers. The crisp paper crackled, a sound oddly loud in the suffocating silence. She opened it, the scent of aged paper and something faintly metallic, the ghost of antiseptic, filling her nostrils. The typed words blurred through her tears, each sentence a fresh wound. She saw her name, her birth date, a litany of diagnoses. Malnutrition, neglect, repeated trauma. Ben's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Alara," he began, his voice soft but firm. She couldn't speak. The words swam before her eyes, a chaotic jumble of medical terminology and chilling descriptions. There were notes, scrawled in hurried handwriting, mentioning the Blackwood family, references to parental unsuitability, and orders from above. One particularly chilling entry spoke of a severe head injury, with a note that read, "Incident unreported per family request." The cold dread that had been a simmering unease now exploded into a raging inferno within her. She pointed a shaking finger at a section detailing a lengthy hospital stay, redacted portions obscuring key information. They hid it," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The room, once simply sterile, now felt like a tomb, the silence heavy with the weight of concealed secrets. Ben pulled a chair closer, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and fierce protectiveness. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice a calming balm against the storm raging inside her. "We'll figure this out. Together." He gently took the file from her, his touch surprisingly steady. "Let's go home. We need to process this." The drive back was a blur. Alara stared out the window, the city lights a shimmering, indifferent backdrop to the turmoil within her. Each streetlight seemed to cast a long, accusing shadow. The weight of the revelations pressed down on her, a suffocating burden that threatened to crush her. The metallic scent, that phantom smell of blood, lingered in her nostrils, a persistent reminder of the horrors detailed within the file. She looked at Ben, her lifeline in this sea of uncertainty. His presence was a silent promise of support, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Hope, a fragile seedling, began to take root amidst the despair. The fight, she realized, was far from over. It had only just begun. The apartment felt smaller, colder now, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked window. Alara sat hunched over the file, the brittle paper a stark contrast to the warmth of Ben's hand resting on hers. The metallic scent, faint but persistent, clung to her like a second skin. She reread the entry about the head injury, the redacted sections mocking her with their deliberate omissions. A sob escaped, ragged and raw. They just erased it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Ben squeezed her hand, his touch firm but gentle. "We'll find out what happened, Alara. We will." His voice, usually calm and reassuring, held a tremor of anger. He knew this wasn't just about a past injury. It was about a deliberate, calculated erasure of her identity. He pointed to a name recurring throughout the file. Dr. Alistair Reed. "This doctor, he seems to have been involved in everything. Should we try to contact him?" Alara looked at the name, a flicker of hope, then doubt. Dr. Reed worked at Blackwood Hospital, the very institution that had, according to these records, actively concealed her trauma. Trust felt like a dangerous gamble now. The thought of facing the Blackwood family directly, of confronting their wealth and influence, sent a shiver down her spine. Fear warred with a newfound, fierce determination. "I don't know," she said, her voice a breathy whisper. "What if he's part of it? What if they've all been complicit?" The rain intensified, the rhythmic drumming a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. The file, a physical manifestation of her stolen past, lay open between them, a testament to the systematic cruelty she'd endured. Ben gently closed the file, his expression a mixture of concern and resolute support. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm raging inside her. "We'll start with small things, gather information. We'll find the truth, Alara. I promise you." His words, simple yet profound, offered a fragile lifeline in the face of overwhelming odds. The fight had begun, and despite the fear, a stubborn ember of hope glowed within her. The fight for her past, for her identity, for herself, had only just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the musty smell of Alara's cramped apartment. The file, now spread across Ben's kitchen table, felt less like a collection of papers and more like a roadmap to a forgotten life. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, highlighting the fragility of the documents. Each brittle page held a piece of Alara's stolen past, each redaction a painful reminder of the deliberate erasure. "Dr. Reed," Alara whispered, tracing the name with a trembling finger. The name felt significant, a potential key, but also a potential trap. He was there, through everything. Ben, ever practical, leaned forward. "We need to find out more about him. His employment history at Blackwood, his interactions with your case." A wave of nausea washed over Alara. The idea of confronting Blackwood Hospital, of facing the imposing edifice of wealth and power that stood behind the institution, filled her with dread. She pictured the imposing building, its pristine exterior belying the darkness she suspected lurked within. "What if he's protecting them?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in her stomach. Ben's hand covered hers, his touch a warm island in a sea of fear. "We'll approach it carefully. We won't go in guns blazing. We'll start with online searches, medical records databases, anything to establish his profile before we reach out." Hope, fragile yet persistent, flickered within her. The weight of the past felt less crushing now, the darkness less absolute. Ben's unwavering support, his calm reassurance, provided a much-needed anchor. She looked at him, at the concern etched in his kind eyes, and a small smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." He squeezed her hand. "We'll face this together, Alara, and we'll find the truth. I promise you." The promise hung between them, a silent pact forged in the face of adversity. The fight was far from over, but in that shared moment of quiet strength, a sense of cautious optimism took root. The journey would be long and fraught with danger, but they would face it together. The file detailed Alara's fragmented childhood, blurred photographs, cryptic medical notes, and chillingly clinical descriptions of neglect. A recurring name, Blackwood, stained the pages like a dark watermark. Each entry felt like a punch to the gut, a renewed wave of nausea. The sterile scent of the hospital, a ghost smell clinging to the papers, triggered a visceral memory. A cold, white room, the muffled cries of a child. Ben, watching her struggle, reached across the table, his touch gentle. "Alara," he said softly, his voice a calming balm against the storm raging inside her. "Take a break. We can go back to this later." She shook her head, her eyes fixed on a faded photograph of a young girl with wide, frightened eyes. The girl bore an uncanny resemblance to herself. A pang of grief, sharp and sudden, pierced her. It was a grief for a life she barely remembered, a life stolen from her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to know." The next entry detailed a surgical procedure, the terse medical jargon barely concealing the gravity of the situation. A whispered conversation between two doctors, partially redacted but still discernible, spoke of a cover-up and a potential scandal. The implications struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already faded ink. She felt a desperate need to understand, to make sense of the chaos contained within these brittle pages. This wasn't just about a lost childhood. It was about justice, about reclaiming a stolen identity. "The Blackwoods," Alara murmured, the name now a bitter taste in her mouth. "They're behind this." Her voice, though trembling, held a newfound strength. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce determination. Ben nodded, his eyes reflecting her newfound resolve. He knew this wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about Alara reclaiming her power, her narrative. He squeezed her hand again, offering silent support. This fight, he knew, was just beginning. The sterile smell of the hospital records was now replaced by the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee, and the shared determination hanging in the air was far stronger than the fear. Alara stared at the faded photograph, a young girl with her eyes, lost in a sterile white room. The scent of antiseptic, sharp and lingering, clung to the paper, a phantom echo of her past. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sound that broke the silence. Ben's hand, warm and reassuring, covered hers. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice a gentle counterpoint to the turmoil within her. "We'll figure this out." She shook her head, tears blurring the already indistinct image. They were supposed to protect me." The words were a choked whisper, a lament for a childhood stolen, a trust betrayed. The weight of it settled heavily on her chest, a suffocating burden. Ben pulled out his phone, the screen's glow illuminating his concerned face. "I'm going to call someone," he said, his voice firm despite the apprehension in his eyes. "A friend of mine, a doctor. He might know something about Blackwood Hospital." Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered within her. The thought of help, of someone understanding, offered a sliver of comfort in the overwhelming darkness. The sterile office felt less confining, the shadows less menacing under the promise of external support. The phone call was short, clipped words exchanged between Ben and a man named Dr. Reed. The conversation was low, hushed, almost conspiratorial. Alara only caught glimpses. Old records, unusually difficult, a need for discretion. The words hung in the air like a silent threat, underscoring the gravity of the situation. Later that evening, seated across a table in a dimly lit cafe, the aroma of rich coffee momentarily distracting her from the chilling truth of her past, Alara felt a fragile sense of alliance with Ben. He offered unwavering support, his quiet strength a stark contrast to her own internal chaos. Dr. Reed's name felt like a lifeline, a beacon in the encroaching storm. "He's willing to meet," Ben said, his gaze meeting hers. "Tomorrow. He wants to see the records himself." A nervous energy thrummed beneath his calm exterior. He was clearly worried, but he was also determined to help, to be her anchor. Alara nodded, a faint smile gracing her lips. The fear was still there, a persistent shadow, but it was tempered by a rising sense of hope, a cautious optimism fueled by the promise of a possible ally. The fight, she knew, was far from over, but for the first time since discovering the records, she didn't feel entirely alone. The cafe hummed with the low thrum of conversation, the clinking of ceramic mugs a comforting counterpoint to the turmoil in Alara's chest. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the city lights into shimmering streaks. The aroma of roasted coffee beans, usually a source of comfort, did little to soothe the knot of anxiety tightening within her. She traced the rim of her mug with a trembling finger, the warmth barely penetrating the chill that had settled deep in her bones. "He seems hesitant," Ben observed, his voice low. He watched her, concern etched on his face, his eyes mirroring the storm raging outside. The dim light accentuated the worry lines that hadn't been there before. Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling coffee in her cup. Dr. Reed's cryptic words echoed in her mind. A need for discretion, significant risk. The implications hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that mirrored the rising storm outside. The initial hope, the fragile optimism of the previous evening, was already fraying at the edges. "He's scared," she whispered, more to herself than to Ben. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about uncovering a long-buried truth. It was about confronting a powerful, entrenched system, a system that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Ben reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, grounding, a lifeline in the rising tide of fear. "We'll be careful," he murmured, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll figure this out together." His words offered a small measure of comfort, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. But Alara knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The fight for the truth had only just begun, and the stakes were far higher than she could have ever imagined. The weight of her past, of the years of neglect and abuse, pressed down on her, a heavy burden she carried alone, despite Ben's presence. The rain intensified, mirroring the storm brewing inside her. Tomorrow, she would face the storm, with Ben by her side, and the faint promise of an ally in the hesitant Dr. Reed. But the fear, the chilling anticipation, remained a cold, persistent companion. The sterile white of Dr. Reed's office felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the comforting warmth of Ben's apartment. Alara fidgeted, the thin paper file clutched in her hands, its contents a chilling testament to her stolen childhood. The scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the hospital's cold, uncaring nature. Dr. Reed, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored her own, studied her with a quiet intensity. The fluorescent lights hummed, a monotonous drone that amplified the silence between them. The inconsistencies, they're staggering, Alara whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum. The photograph, for the silenced nurse, for all those who had suffered at the hands of the Blackwood family's callous indifference. The game had changed. The hunt was on. The chipped teacup warmed Annabelle's trembling hands. The cottage, smelling faintly of lavender and regret, felt like a sanctuary, a fragile bubble shielding them from the storm brewing outside. Alara, her gaze fixed on the faded photograph, felt a kinship with the child, a silent understanding across the chasm of years. The girl's eyes, hauntingly familiar, mirrored her own haunted expression. They promised me silence, a good life, Annabelle whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. But the nightmares, they never stopped. Ben's hand squeezed Alara's, a silent reassurance in the face of shared sorrow. The weight of Annabelle's confession pressed down on them, a tangible burden in the small, dimly lit room. Alara saw the years etched onto Annabelle's face, years of carrying a secret, of living with a burden that had warped her soul. They threatened my family, Annabelle continued, her voice gaining a sliver of steel, said they'd ruin them if I spoke. But seeing you, seeing that photograph, it's like the guilt has finally broken through. She looked at Alara, a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes. I remember everything, the hushed conversations, the late-night meetings, the hushed whispers, the way they treated her, like she wasn't even human. Tears streamed down Annabelle's face, but her resolve held firm. I have a ledger, she said, her voice low and urgent. A ledger with every detail, every payment, every threat, everything they did. It's hidden, but I can get it. A flicker of defiance ignited in her eyes, a spark in the dying embers of her hope. The risk was immense, the potential repercussions terrifying, but the weight of her guilt had finally been overcome by a desperate need for justice. Alara reached across the table, her fingers brushing Annabelle's. Thank you, she whispered, the words choked with emotion. The gratitude was profound, a surge of hope amidst the darkness. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice for a child, for a silenced witness, for all those who had suffered in silence. The fight had become a sacred mission. The hunt was on, and the game had irrevocably changed. The chipped teacup warmed Annabelle's trembling hands. Lavender hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear clinging to her. Outside, the wind howled, mirroring the storm brewing within her. Alara, her gaze fixed on the faded photograph, felt a bone-deep connection to the child, a silent pact across the years. Those haunted eyes, identical to her own. They promised silence, Annabelle whispered, her voice cracking like brittle ice. A good life, but the nightmares, they never stopped. Ben's hand, warm and reassuring, squeezed Alara's. The cottage, small and cluttered, felt suffocating under the weight of Annabelle's confession. Alara saw the years etched onto Annabelle's face, a landscape of regret, etched deep by years of carrying a secret. The burden had warped her, twisting her features, hollowing her eyes. They threatened my family, she continued, her voice gaining a surprising strength. Said they'd ruin us if I spoke. But seeing you, seeing that photograph, a tear escaped, tracing a path through the lines etched by time. The guilt, it finally broke through. The flicker of defiance in her eyes, a tiny ember against the vast darkness, filled Alara with a mixture of hope and dread. I remember everything, Annabelle said, her voice low and urgent. The hushed conversations, the late-night meetings, the whispered secrets, the way they treated her, like she wasn't even human. More tears fell, but her resolve held. "I have a ledger," she breathed. "A ledger with every detail, every payment, every threat, everything they did. It's hidden, but I can get it." The risk was terrifying, the potential consequences catastrophic. But the weight of her guilt, finally surpassed by a desperate need for justice, fueled her. Alara reached across the small table, her fingers brushing Annabelle's. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. The gratitude was immense, a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. This wasn't just about Alara anymore. It was about justice, for a child, for a silenced witness, for all those who had suffered in the shadows. The fight had become a sacred mission. The hunt was on, and the rules had changed. The following morning, the crisp autumn air bit at Alara's cheeks as she walked back to the cottage, Annabelle's words echoing in her ears. The ledger. The thought vibrated with a dangerous energy, a fragile hope flickering against the looming threat of the Blackwood family. The scent of wood smoke clung to her clothes, a stark contrast to the sterile, antiseptic smell of Blackwood Hospital. Ben greeted her at the door, concern etched on his face. "She's okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Alara nodded, the enormity of what Annabelle had revealed still settling within her. "She's brave," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. The cottage, small and cozy, felt different now. Before, it had been a refuge. Now, it hummed with the weight of secrets and the promise of a confrontation. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust, tiny particles mirroring the chaos that was brewing. "We need a plan," Ben said, his gaze intense. He'd always been practical, a grounding force in Alara's increasingly turbulent life. Now, his quiet strength was a lifeline. "I don't know," Alara whispered, running a hand through her hair, her fingers tangling in the loose strands. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The Blackwoods wouldn't hesitate to silence Annabelle permanently. "They'll find her. They'll stop her." Ben reached for her hand, his touch firm but gentle. "We won't let them," he said, his voice unwavering. "We'll protect her. We'll get that ledger." He looked at her, eyes filled with determination. "We have to." The weight of responsibility, of the fight ahead, pressed down on Alara. But seeing the unwavering resolve in Ben's eyes, she felt a surge of strength. She wasn't alone. The fear remained, sharp and cold, but it was tempered by a new kind of determination. A fierce, protective loyalty to the woman who had risked everything to help her. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Alara felt a flicker of hope, a tiny flame in the overwhelming darkness. The hunt for justice was on, and they wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. The chipped paint on Anna's cottage door seemed to mirror the cracks in her composure. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of stale tea and something indefinably melancholic. Anna, a frail woman with eyes that held the weight of decades of unspoken secrets, nervously wrung her hands. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows, making her already gaunt features seem even sharper. "It's risky," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible above the tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner. "They'll come after me." Fear, raw and palpable, clung to her like a shroud. Alara, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, reached out and gently squeezed Anna's hand. "I know," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her own hands. "But we need this ledger. It's the only way to prove what happened." Ben, standing silently by the window, watched the interplay of fear and determination on their faces. The shadows danced across his own, adding an air of grim resolve. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, a fitting soundtrack to the precariousness of their situation. Anna hesitated, her gaze darting nervously towards the window. The wind rattled the panes, each gust a potential intrusion. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, she produced a worn, leather-bound book from beneath a loose floorboard. The leather was cracked and faded, but the metal clasp gleamed faintly in the dim light. "It's everything," Anna choked out, handing the ledger to Alara. "Every detail. The injections, the hushed conversations, the cover-up." Tears streamed down her face, leaving glistening tracks through the dust on her cheeks. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Alara opened the ledger, the brittle pages whispering secrets of a dark past. The ink, faded and smudged, nonetheless spoke volumes. The meticulous entries documented years of systematic cruelty, a chilling testament to the Blackwood family's ruthless manipulation. A cold dread gripped Alara's heart, a chilling confirmation of her worst fears. This was far bigger than she could have ever imagined. This was a fight for survival. "They'll find out," Anna cried, her voice rising to a desperate plea. They'll kill me." Ben stepped forward, his hand resting reassuringly on Anna's shoulder. "We won't let them," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of fear. "We'll protect you." His gaze shifted to Alara, his eyes conveying a silent promise of unwavering support. The fight had just begun, and the stakes had just been raised exponentially. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Alara's clothes, a stark contrast to the musty smell of Anna's cottage. Back in her cramped apartment, the ledger lay open on her worn kitchen table, its faded ink a stark reminder of the horrors it contained. Each entry was a stab to her heart, a fresh wound reopening old scars. The flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows on the pages, making the meticulous script seem almost alive. Ben, ever watchful, sat beside her, his brow furrowed with concern. He'd helped her carefully photograph each page, his steady hands a comfort amidst the chaos. "This is overwhelming," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. He reached for her hand, his touch grounding her in the present, a lifeline in the swirling vortex of her past. Alara nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "More than I ever imagined. They systematically destroyed her, us. It's not just about me anymore." A wave of nausea washed over her, the weight of the evidence, the enormity of the Blackwood family's crimes pressing down on her. The faint scent of coffee from the brewing machine seemed suddenly sickening. "We need a lawyer," Ben said firmly, his voice betraying a steely determination. "Someone who won't be intimidated by the Blackwoods." His eyes held a fierce protectiveness, a reassurance that warmed her despite the icy dread that still gripped her. Alara looked up, a flicker of hope igniting in her weary eyes. "You're right, but finding the right one, it feels like searching for a needle in a haystack. Everyone seems connected to them in some way." She traced a trembling finger across a particularly chilling entry detailing the experimental treatments, the blatant disregard for human life. The harsh lines of the script seemed to mock her, reminding her of the years she spent struggling to piece together her fragmented memories. Ben squeezed her hand again, his gaze unwavering. "We'll find someone. We'll find a way. This ledger, it's our weapon, and we won't let them silence it." His words, infused with unwavering support, were a balm to her wounded soul, a promise in the face of overwhelming odds. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple, a silent testament to the battle she was about to wage. The fight, she knew, was far from over. The air in the small, cluttered office tasted of stale coffee and desperation. Alara traced the lines of a legal document, her fingertip leaving a smudge of ink on the brittle paper. The lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Ms. Davies, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, reviewed the photographs of Anna's ledger. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed a discordant tune to the anxieties churning in Alara's stomach. "The evidence is compelling, Miss Vance," Ms. Davies conceded, her voice devoid of warmth. "But the Blackwoods, they have resources beyond imagination. They'll fight this tooth and nail." Alara met her gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "They can try, but I have nothing left to lose." The words felt both brave and terrifying all at once. The weight of her past, of Anna's sacrifice, fueled her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice for the voiceless. "I need you to understand," Ms. Davies pressed, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They'll attempt to discredit Anna. They'll try to smear you. Be prepared for unpleasantness." A chill snaked down Alara's spine. The lawyer's words painted a stark picture of the battles ahead, a relentless onslaught from a powerful family with limitless resources. The thought of the Blackwood's wrath, the potential for further attacks, was daunting. Ben entered, his presence a calming influence amidst the storm brewing in the room. He carried 2 steaming cups, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee a comforting counterpoint to the sterile atmosphere. He placed one in front of Alara, the warmth radiating through the ceramic mug, a small act of kindness in a room overflowing with legal jargon and threats. "How's it going?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers. He saw the apprehension etched on her face, the weariness weighing down her spirit. Alara took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through her. "It's a long road ahead," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "Ms. Davies is right. They won't go down without a fight." Ben's hand covered hers, a silent pledge of support. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We have the truth on our side, and that's a powerful weapon." His words were a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Alara squeezed his hand, finding strength in his unwavering belief. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. The fight was theirs, and they would face it together. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air as Alara stared at the meticulously organized files stacked on Ms. Davies's desk. Each folder represented a piece of her stolen past, a fragment of a life the Blackwoods had tried to erase. The fluorescent lights buzzed, a relentless counterpoint to the pounding in her chest. "They'll use everything," Ms. Davies repeated, her voice low and serious. "Your past, your present, anything to discredit you." Alara felt a chill despite the warm office. The weight of the impending battle pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of fear and doubt. She glanced at Ben, his presence a comforting island in the sea of anxiety. He watched her, his expression a mixture of concern and unwavering support. His hand, resting on hers beneath the table, offered a silent reassurance. "I know," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the lights. The fear wasn't just for herself anymore. It extended to Ben, to Dr. Reed, to Anna, whose courageous act had put them all in the crosshairs of the Blackwood family's wrath. The thought of Anna, vulnerable and alone, fueled a fresh surge of anger, a raw, protective rage that burned away some of her fear. Ms. Davies's sharp intake of breath interrupted the quiet moment. "There's something else," she said, her gaze fixed on a photograph. It was a blurry image, taken from a distance, showing a shadowy figure lurking near Anna's apartment building. This was taken the night before Anna's statement. "We're trying to enhance it, but..." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The image wasn't just a picture. It was a chilling premonition of the violence to come, a tangible manifestation of the Blackwood family's power and ruthlessness. Alara felt a cold dread creep into her heart, a sickening fear for Anna's safety. The fight had become more than a legal battle. It was now a desperate race against time. Ben's hand tightened on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the escalating danger. The warmth of his touch was a lifeline, a tiny flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. The weight of their shared struggle settled heavily between them. A silent pact formed in the face of overwhelming odds. The road ahead was long, arduous, and fraught with peril, but they would face it together. The air in Ms. Davies's office felt thick with unspoken anxieties. The scent of old paper and stale coffee clung to the plush carpeting, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical smells Alara had grown accustomed to. She traced the chipped edge of her mug, the lukewarm tea doing little to soothe the tremor in her hands. The photograph, a grainy, almost indiscernible image of a shadowed figure, felt like a physical weight in her chest. "We're working on enhancing it," Ms. Davies repeated, her voice tight with concern. But the police, they're hesitant. The Blackwoods have influence. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, the implication clear. Ben squeezed Alara's hand, his touch a grounding force amidst the swirling chaos of fear. "We'll find a way," he murmured, his voice low and steady, a reassuring balm to her frayed nerves. His eyes, usually twinkling with warmth, held a steely determination that mirrored her own. Alara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The threat against Anna was a stark reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about uncovering a family secret anymore. It was about protecting the few allies she had, about fighting for justice against overwhelming odds. The weight of responsibility pressed down, heavy and suffocating. "We need to move quickly," Alara said, her voice firmer than she felt. The chilling image of the lurking figure fueled her resolve. Fear was a powerful motivator, but it was not going to break her. She would not let the Blackwoods win. Not this time. Ms. Davies nodded grimly. "I've prepared a preliminary outline of the case. We need to focus on..." She launched into a detailed explanation of legal strategies, her words a stream of carefully chosen phrases, outlining the challenges and the potential avenues for success. Alara listened intently, absorbing the information, the fear gradually giving way to a grim determination. The fight had just begun, and this time she wouldn't fight alone. The fluorescent lights of Blackwood Hospital hummed, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of Alara's heart. Dr. Reed's office felt smaller than she remembered, the antiseptic scent sharper, more suffocating. He sat behind his desk, his usually calm face etched with worry. The confidential file lay open between them, a damning testament to the Blackwood family's cruelty. "The ethics board," Dr. Reed began, his voice a low murmur. "They're unyielding. They're protecting their own." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. I can't openly support your case. Not yet." Alara's breath hitched. The weight of his words landed heavily. The fragile hope she'd clung to, a tiny ember in the vast darkness, threatened to extinguish. She felt a familiar chill creep up her spine, the same ice-cold dread that had haunted her since discovering her records. "But you can help," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "You know the truth. You were there." She met his gaze, searching for any sign of wavering, any flicker of the compassion she knew existed beneath the surface. He looked away, his eyes falling on the file. "There are discrepancies, things that don't add up. Information I can subtly redirect, suggest further investigation into other areas. It's risky, but..." He hesitated, his gaze finally meeting hers, a profound sadness in his eyes. "I can't stand by and watch them get away with this." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. Alara saw not just guilt in his eyes, but profound regret. The man who had once been a symbol of the cold, uncaring institution was now a fellow fighter in this desperate battle. Hope, fragile but tenacious, rekindled in her chest. The weight on her shoulders didn't lessen, but it shifted. It became shared weight, a burden now carried by two. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The gratitude she felt was a profound and bittersweet thing, a small victory in a war far from over. The fight was long, the path uncertain, but she was no longer alone. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed less oppressive now, the scent of antiseptic less suffocating. A glimmer of hope, however faint, pierced through the darkness. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Alara like a second skin as she left Dr. Reed's office. Outside, the midday sun felt brutally bright, a stark contrast to the dim, hushed corridors of Blackwood Hospital. She squinted, the light momentarily blinding. Hope, a fragile seedling, had taken root in the bleak landscape of her despair, but the soil remained hard. The weight of the evidence, the enormity of the task ahead, pressed down on her. Ben's warm smile was a balm to her frayed nerves when she reached his apartment. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the air, a comforting domesticity miles removed from the clinical coldness of the hospital. He pulled her into a hug, his embrace firm yet gentle. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Alara sank onto the worn sofa, the plush fabric a welcome relief against her tense muscles. "He'll help," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Subtly. He can't openly defy the Blackwood family. Not yet. But he'll guide the investigation, steer it in the right direction." Ben nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and grim determination. "That's something," he murmured, handing her a steaming mug. "We need every advantage we can get." He took a seat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. The simple gesture spoke volumes of support, unwavering faith in her, in their cause. A low hum of anxiety vibrated beneath the surface of their quiet conversation. The realization that they were up against a formidable opponent, a family steeped in wealth and influence, settled heavily on them both. The coffee, warm and comforting, did little to alleviate the icy grip of fear that threatened to consume them. Alara's hands were still trembling slightly as she took a sip, her gaze lingering on Ben's concerned face, seeking solace in his steady presence. The next step was painstakingly meticulous. Alara spent the next few days poring over old newspaper clippings, searching for any mention of similar incidents, any hint of a pattern. The silence from Mr. Sterling was deafening, a chilling testament to the Blackwood family's power. The hours bled into days, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of urgency. Each piece of evidence she unearthed, a hidden report, a forgotten interview, felt like a small victory, a tiny crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of the Blackwoods' influence. The fight was far from over. The battle had just begun. The chipped paint on Ben's kitchen table felt rough beneath Alara's trembling fingers. The scent of cinnamon, usually comforting, now felt cloying, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. "He's stalling," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. The silence that followed stretched, thick and suffocating. Ben's hand, warm and reassuring, covered hers. "Sterling's silence is a tactic, Alara. He's buying time." His voice was calm, a steady anchor in the storm raging inside her. But his eyes held a flicker of worry that mirrored her own. Alara swallowed, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "But what if they destroy everything? All the evidence, everything we've worked for." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already faded floral pattern of the tablecloth. Ben pulled her close, his embrace a silent promise of support. "We won't let them, Alara. We've got Dr. Reed, Anna. We have something they can't erase. The truth." His words, though meant to reassure, felt fragile, almost as brittle as the hope clinging to the edges of her despair. A sudden sharp rap on the door jolted them. Alara froze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Ben rose cautiously, his hand hovering protectively over her. He moved to the door, his movements slow and measured. He peered through the peephole, his breath hitched. He opened the door a crack. A uniformed police officer stood on the threshold, his face impassive. "Ms. Alara Vance?" he asked, his voice formal, devoid of any warmth. Ben's hand tightened on Alara's, his knuckles white. The blood drained from Alara's face. The cinnamon rolls, the warm coffee, the comfort of Ben's presence, all felt miles away. A cold dread, sharp and icy, gripped her heart. The game, it seemed, had just changed. The fight had escalated. The next move was theirs. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the floral perfume clinging faintly to Dr. Reed's crisp white coat. He sat across from Alara, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a visible internal struggle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on his worried face. Alara, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "They're pressuring me, Alara," he confessed, his voice a low murmur barely audible above the hum. "Sterling, he's relentless. He's threatening everything." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The weight of his unspoken words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Alara's breath hitched. She understood. The Blackwoods' power extended far beyond their wealth. It was a suffocating web of influence, capable of crushing anyone who dared to challenge it. She had seen the fear in Anna's eyes, the trembling in her hands. She felt it herself, a chilling dread that clung to her like a shroud. "What are they threatening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet laced with a steely resolve that surprised even herself. She wouldn't let fear cripple her. Not now. Not after everything she'd been through. Dr. Reed hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window overlooking the manicured hospital grounds, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. "My license," he finally said, the words tight with regret. "My career. Everything I've worked for." He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow. I can't risk it, Alara. Not for this." A wave of icy disappointment washed over Alara. The weight of his words pressed down on her, the crushing weight of betrayal. It was a blow, a sharp, stinging jab to her already wounded heart. But before despair could fully consume her, a different emotion began to surface. A hard, cold anger. "Then let me risk it," she said, her voice low and steady, the steel in her tone now sharp and unwavering. "Because I won't let them win. I won't let them bury the truth again." She stood, her chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Her resolve, once fragile, was now a burning ember, threatening to ignite into a blazing inferno. She would fight. She had to. The fight was far from over. The mahogany door of Mrs. Blackwood's office gleamed under the soft light, a stark contrast to the shadowed corners of the opulent room. Alara, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a simmering rage. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, filled the air, a deliberate attempt to mask the coldness radiating from the woman seated behind the massive desk. Mrs. Blackwood, a vision of icy elegance in a severe black dress, regarded Alara with an unnerving calm. Her eyes, the color of glacial ice, held a lifetime of secrets and a chilling lack of remorse. "So, you've come to confront me, Miss Alara, wasn't it?" Her voice was smooth, cultured, a weapon in itself. Alara met her gaze, refusing to flinch. "I've come for the truth, Mrs. Blackwood, about what happened to me at Blackwood Hospital." The words felt brittle, yet held a power that surprised even her. Mrs. Blackwood let out a low, almost melodic chuckle. "Truth is a subjective thing, my dear, especially when it's been buried so deeply." She gestured to the plush armchair opposite her desk. "Sit. Let us discuss this objectively." Alara sat, the velvet sinking beneath her, offering no comfort. She watched as Mrs. Blackwood steepled her fingers, the diamonds on her rings flashing in the dim light. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique clock, each tick a hammer blow against Alara's patience. "You've had your fun playing detective," Mrs. Blackwood finally said, her voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "But you're wasting your time. The past is the past. The past is full of things you tried to bury, Mrs. Blackwood," Alara countered, her voice steady. "Things that are starting to resurface. Things that will cost you." A flicker of something, anger, fear, crossed Mrs. Blackwood's face before she regained her composure. "Threats, Miss Alara? How very unoriginal." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me remind you of your position. You're a nobody, a forgotten ghost." The word stung, but Alara refused to show it. Instead, she drew a deep breath, the scent of lilies suddenly nauseating. She pulled out a small, worn photograph, a picture of a younger Alara, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own current apprehension. "This is not forgotten," Alara stated, her voice firm, each word a carefully placed brick in a wall she was building. "And neither is the truth." The photograph, a silent testament to a stolen childhood, lay between them, a fragile bridge between past and present. The fight had truly begun. The photograph, a stark contrast to the opulent room, hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Blackwood's icy calm cracked, revealing a flicker of something akin to fear beneath the carefully constructed facade. The lilies, once a subtle weapon, now felt suffocating. Elara, however, felt strangely empowered. The photograph was more than just a picture. It was a lifeline. "This isn't just about me, Mrs. Blackwood." Elara's voice, though trembling slightly, held a newfound strength. "It's about all the others, the ones you silenced." Mrs. Blackwood's hand tightened around her teacup, the delicate china creaking under the pressure. "You're deluding yourself," she hissed, the cultured veneer finally shattering. "You're grasping at straws, fueled by resentment and, what is it? A thirst for revenge." "It's about justice," Elara corrected, her gaze unwavering, "and about making sure no one else suffers the way I did." She saw a fleeting glimpse of something akin to regret in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes, quickly masked by a return to her icy composure. But the crack was there, a hairline fracture in the impenetrable wall of her composure. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the antique clock, each beat a relentless reminder of the time stolen from Elara's life. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with years of buried secrets threatening to erupt. "You underestimate my reach, Miss Elara," Mrs. Blackwood said finally, her voice a low growl. "You think this little rebellion will succeed? You're naive." Elara stood, her legs shaky but her resolve unyielding. Herself. It was for the truth, buried beneath layers of wealth and influence, for Anna, and for every other silenced voice. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and rustling papers. Elara felt the weight of every eye upon her, a tangible pressure against her chest. The photograph, a cruel mockery of a healthy child, loomed large in her memory, a stark contrast to the fragmented images of her own pain. Sterling's smug smile was a physical blow. "Miss Elara," he purred, his voice a silken blade, "your testimony is unconvincing. This photograph clearly shows a child without any visible signs of trauma." He held it aloft, the bright light glinting off the polished surface. A wave of nausea rolled over Elara. The air felt thick, suffocating. Doubt, a cold, insidious tendril, snaked around her heart. Had she invented it all? Had the years blurred the lines between reality and the agonizing phantom pains of her memory? Ben's hand squeezed hers, a silent promise of support, a grounding presence in the chaos. Dr. Reed's worried gaze offered a silent apology, a shared understanding of the insidious power of the Blackwood family's wealth. His guilt was palpable, a silent tremor in the air. "That's not the whole story," Elara managed, her voice barely a whisper, cracking under the pressure. Tears welled, blurring the already indistinct faces in the gallery. The taste of salt filled her mouth. "There's more. They hid things. Medical records, treatments. They concealed the true extent of the neglect. The emotional abuse. Each word was a painful extraction, a raw confession tugging at the seams of her composure. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. The weight of years of suppressed pain threatened to crush her. Yet, in Ben's unwavering gaze, in Dr. Reed's silent empathy, she found a fragile spark of resolve, reignited. The photograph was a weapon, yes, but not the ultimate truth. And she would fight for the rest of it. The battle was far from over, but this fight was not just her own. It was for Anna, for every silenced voice swallowed by the Blackwood machine. The truth, she knew, was still buried, somewhere beneath layers of carefully constructed lies and overwhelming wealth. The fight, however, had just begun. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat, felt suffocating. Elara's throat tightened, a lump of fear lodged deep within. Sterling's words echoed, a cruel taunt in the oppressive silence. She felt Ben's hand, a lifeline in the storm, but even his unwavering support couldn't quell the rising tide of doubt. Dr. Reed's gaze, filled with a silent plea for forgiveness, mirrored her own internal struggle. Had she, In her desperate grasp for justice, misremembered? Had the years distorted the truth? A sudden commotion broke the tension. A hushed gasp rippled through the gallery. A figure stumbled into the courtroom, disheveled and clearly distressed. Anna, the former nurse, her face, etched with fear and exhaustion, was a testament to the Blackwood family's ruthless power. She clutched a crumpled envelope to her chest, her breath ragged. I have something," Anna gasped, her voice trembling. "Evidence. They threatened me, but—" She looked directly at Alara, her eyes pleading for understanding. Sterling, his composure momentarily shattered, leaped to his feet. "Objection. This is irrelevant and highly prejudicial." His voice, sharp and brittle, cut through the air. The judge, however, remained impassive, his gaze unwavering. Anna, ignoring Sterling's outburst, approached the witness stand. Her shaking hand offered the envelope to Alara. Inside, nestled amongst fragile papers, lay a single, faded medical chart Alara's own. But this wasn't the same chart she discovered. This one contained a handwritten note, a chilling postscript detailing a series of experimental treatments concealed from the official record. Treatments that explained the lingering effects of her childhood trauma, treatments that proved the Blackwoods' deliberate cruelty. The courtroom held its breath. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just a memory. This was undeniable proof. She glanced at Ben, his eyes mirroring her dawning hope, and at Dr. Reed, his guilt warring with a flicker of renewed belief. The scales of justice, once tilted heavily against her, seemed to shift, ever so slightly, towards the truth. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, victory felt possible. The photograph remained, a constant reminder of the family's cruelty, but now it was just one piece of the puzzle, the bigger picture finally taking shape. The tide was turning. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of whispered anxieties. Anna, pale and trembling, clutched the envelope like a lifeline. Alara, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, felt Ben's hand squeeze hers reassuringly. The faded medical chart, the chilling postscript, it was a fragile beacon in the overwhelming darkness. Sterling's objection, sharp and brittle, echoed in the tense silence, a desperate attempt to stifle the truth. But the judge, his expression unreadable, remained impassive. Anna's voice, barely a whisper, filled the suffocating courtroom. They told me to forget, said it would be better for everyone. But I couldn't live with it. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the smudged ink on her fingers. Her gaze, filled with a mixture of fear and a newfound resolve, locked with Alara's. This proves it, Anna stammered, pushing the envelope across the polished mahogany table. The experimental treatments, they caused her condition. They knew. Alara's breath hitched. The weight of years, of suppressed memories, threatened to crush her. The cold, sterile reality of the courtroom seemed to melt away as the truth, raw and brutal, flooded back. The photograph, the symbol of the Blackwoods' callous disregard, now served as a chilling prelude to the brutal evidence. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming her stolen past. Mr. Sterling, his carefully constructed facade crumbling, launched into a tirade, his words a frantic attempt to discredit Anna. He spoke of coercion, of unreliable memory, his voice laced with desperation. Yet, the judge's unyielding gaze, coupled with the weight of Anna's testimony, slowly shifted the momentum. The courtroom, once a cage of fear, now felt pregnant with a cautious, fragile hope. Alara felt Ben's strength, his quiet support anchoring her. She looked to Dr. Reed, his guilt-ridden face now illuminated by a glimmer of relief, a silent apology for his past complicity. This wasn't just Alara's fight anymore. It was a collective rebellion against the Blackwoods' reign of terror. Justice, once a distant dream, now seemed within reach. The weight of the truth, finally laid bare, hung heavy in the air, a tangible promise of retribution. The courtroom air, thick with tension, tasted metallic. Alara felt Ben's hand tighten on hers, a silent reassurance against the storm brewing. Anna's testimony hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly's wing, yet potent enough to shatter the Blackwood's carefully constructed facade. Mr. Sterling's voice, a venomous serpent hissing, sliced through the silence, attempting to discredit Anna's harrowing account. His words, sharp and precise, were designed to dismantle her credibility, but his desperation only served to highlight the truth's unshakable power. Coercion, he spat, the word echoing in the hushed chamber. A frail woman, manipulated by a vengeful outsider. He gestured dramatically towards Alara, his eyes glittering with malice. Alara, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs, met his gaze with unwavering defiance. The years of silence, of suppressed memories, fueled a fierce resolve. She wouldn't let him win. Not now. Dr. Reed, seated in the spectator gallery, watched with a mixture of guilt and hope. His gaze, heavy with regret, lingered on Alara, a silent apology for his past inaction. He knew the truth, the terrible secret hidden behind the Blackwood's polished veneer, and he wouldn't let it remain buried any longer. Suddenly, a gasp rippled through the courtroom. A young woman, her face pale and drawn, stumbled into the aisle. It was Chloe, Anna's daughter, clutching a worn photograph, the same photograph that had ignited Alara's investigation. She approached the stand, her voice trembling, offering corroborating evidence, a devastating blow to the Blackwood's carefully constructed defense. The photograph, a chilling reminder of the Blackwood's callous disregard, served as a visual testament to their cruelty. The image, now projected onto the large screen, showed Alara as a child, frail and neglected, a stark contrast to the opulent lifestyle of her tormentors. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. The judge, his expression unreadable, leaned forward, his attention riveted on the unfolding drama. The fragile hope that had flickered earlier now burned brighter, illuminating the path towards justice. But even as the tide turned, a profound sense of loss began to creep into Alara's heart. The price of truth, she realized, might be far higher than she had ever imagined. The courtroom's hushed expectancy was shattered. A scream, raw and piercing, ripped through the air. Alara's breath hitched. It was Chloe, the fragile girl, her face contorted in a mask of terror, clutched her chest, her body convulsing. The photograph, clutched in her trembling hand, slipped to the polished floor, its stark image Alara as a child, eyes wide with fear, a forgotten testament in the chaos. Panic erupted. The judge banged his gavel, a futile attempt to restore order amidst the rising tide of fear. Ben, his face ashen, rushed to Chloe's side, his urgent whispers lost in the cacophony. The elegant courtroom, moments before a stage for meticulously crafted accusations, transformed into a scene of urgent, chaotic life-saving. Medical personnel surged forward, their movements efficient yet strained, the sterile scent of antiseptic a jarring contrast to the raw emotion filling the air. Alara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chilling premonition. The victory she'd felt moments before, fragile as it was, crumbled. The weight of what she was fighting for, justice, yes, but also retribution, pressed down with crushing force. This wasn't just about exposing the Blackwoods. It was about the collateral damage, the unforeseen consequences of her quest. Mr. Sterling, watching the unfolding drama with a predatory gleam in his eyes, smirked. His victory, it seemed, might not be as distant as he'd believed. The chaos served him well. He'd sown seeds of discord, and now he reaped the whirlwind. Alara, her gaze fixed on Chloe's still form, felt a wave of nausea. The cost, she realized, was becoming unbearably high. The fight, the relentless pursuit of truth, had begun to feel less like a battle for justice and more like a relentless, self-destructive spiral. The question hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight on her chest. Was any amount of justice worth this? The vibrant hope she'd clung to was dimming, replaced by a desolate grief. She stared at the lifeless image of her younger self, a silent accusation hanging in the still air. The price of uncovering the truth, it seemed, was a profound and heart-wrenching loss. The sterile scent of antiseptic fought a losing battle against the cloying sweetness of fear. Chloe lay still, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a stark counterpoint to the hushed whispers circling her. Alara knelt beside her, the cold tile seeping into her knees, her fingers tracing the faint pulse fluttering at Chloe's wrist. Ben's hand rested on Alara's shoulder, a silent offering of support that felt heavy, inadequate. "She'll be all right," Ben murmured, his voice rough with unshed tears. His words were a balm, but Alara felt no comfort. The image of Chloe's terror, the frantic clutch at her chest, was seared into her memory. Mr. Sterling, a predator circling wounded prey, watched from the periphery. His lips curved into a thin, cruel smile. The chaos, the uncertainty, was playing perfectly into his hands. He'd silenced a witness, throwing a wrench into the carefully constructed narrative Alara had woven. The judge, his face etched with concern, addressed the court. His voice, usually authoritative, now held a tremor of uncertainty. "The proceedings are adjourned. Ms. Blackwood, your attorney will be in contact." His words hung in the air, a fragile truce in the face of escalating turmoil. Alara rose, her legs shaky, the weight of the world pressing down. The courtroom, once a stage for her fight, now felt like a tomb. The vibrant hope she'd carried, flickering like a candle in a storm, was extinguished. The pursuit of justice, once a beacon of light, now felt like a treacherous path leading to a precipice. "Alara," Ben's voice cut through the haze of her despair. He pulled her close, his embrace a lifeline in the swirling vortex of doubt and grief. "It's not over." His words, though meant to reassure, felt hollow. The vibrant hope of a clear victory was now a distant memory, replaced by the gnawing fear that the cost might outweigh the reward. The question echoed in the sterile silence of the adjourned court. Was justice worth this profound and agonizing loss? The answer, Alara knew, remained elusive, hidden behind a veil of grief and uncertainty. The fight was far from over. It had just taken a devastating turn. The sterile air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken accusations that swirled around the adjourned courtroom. Alara felt Ben's hand, a comforting weight on her arm, but its warmth did little to thaw the icy grip of fear that had settled in her bones. Chloe's pale face, the flat line on the monitor, those images burned into her retinas, a grotesque slideshow of her failure. The hallway outside was a blur of hushed conversations and hurried footsteps, the polished floor reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Each click of her heels echoed in the cavernous space, amplifying the silence in her heart. The scent of antiseptic, usually a neutral background hum, now felt acrid, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. "Alara." Ben's voice was low, laced with a concern that mirrored her own. He squeezed her arm gently. "We need to regroup. We'll figure this out." His words, though meant to be reassuring, sounded brittle, fragile as a spiderweb in a storm. She didn't have the energy to argue, to fight back the wave of despair that threatened to drown her. The carefully constructed case, the painstakingly gathered evidence, it all felt like dust, scattered by a careless wind. She could almost feel Mr. Sterling's gaze, cold and predatory, lingering on her back. His victory was palpable, a silent taunt in the chilling silence. He'd not only silenced a witness, he'd shattered Alara's fragile hope, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The fight wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the muted tones of the hospital lobby. The subdued chatter of the waiting area felt distant, muffled, as if separated by a thick pane of glass. Even the sunlight filtering through the large windows couldn't pierce the darkness that had enveloped her. Reaching the car, Ben opened the door for her, his movements gentle, almost hesitant. He didn't speak, understanding the futility of words in the face of such profound grief. As he slid behind the wheel, the quiet hum of the engine was a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside her. The drive home was a blur, a silent journey through a landscape of shattered dreams. The question of justice, once burning bright, now flickered dimly, threatened by the suffocating weight of loss. The fight, she knew, was far from over. But now it was a fight for survival, not just for justice. The sterile scent of the hospital clung to Alara like a shroud. The fluorescent lights hummed, a relentless counterpoint to the throbbing in her temples. Ben's hand, still warm on her arm, felt strangely distant, a phantom comfort in the face of her overwhelming grief. Chloe's absence was a gaping wound, raw and bleeding. The whispered condolences of the lawyer, a hollow echo of platitudes, did nothing to fill the void. "We need to," Ben began, his voice catching in his throat. Alara shook her head, unable to articulate the crushing weight of despair. The polished floor reflected the bleakness in her eyes, mirroring the emptiness she felt inside. The elevator doors hissed open, revealing the muted chaos of the lobby. The hushed whispers of concerned faces swam before her, blurry and indistinct. She felt detached, observing herself from a distant vantage point, a silent spectator in her own life. Outside, the city lights blurred into a hazy tapestry through her tear-filled eyes. The air, crisp and cold, did little to soothe the burning in her chest. The car, usually a haven, felt like a cage, confining her to the suffocating reality of her loss. "Mr. Sterling," Alara finally managed, her voice a threadbare whisper. The name hung in the air, heavy with accusation, with the bitter taste of betrayal. The unspoken threat, the chilling implication of Chloe's death, coiled around her like a venomous snake. Ben's jaw tightened. "We'll deal with him. We'll find a way to make them pay." His voice was strained, laced with a fury she barely recognized, a mirroring of her own simmering rage. The carefully planned strategy, their meticulously assembled case, felt futile, reduced to ashes by Chloe's silencing. The drive home was a blur of flashing lights and indistinct images, a silent movie playing out in her mind. The city's vibrant energy felt muted, filtered through a thick lens of grief. Home wasn't a refuge. It was a stark reminder of the life she'd built, a life now irrevocably altered by a single act of calculated cruelty. Reaching her apartment, the familiar comfort was absent, replaced by an echoing emptiness that matched the hollow ache in her soul. Ben gently guided her towards the sofa, his silence a testament to his understanding. He simply sat beside her, his presence a silent promise of support in the face of an unimaginable loss, a shared burden in the wake of a devastating betrayal. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The courtroom felt colder than the winter wind howling outside. Alara's breath hitched in her chest, a fragile puff of white against the hushed silence. Mr. Sterling, a predator in tailored suit, leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. His eyes, cold and calculating, met hers. They spoke volumes, a silent declaration of war. The judge's gavel, a sharp crack, sliced through the tension. The testimony continued, each word a hammer blow against Alara's already fractured spirit. Ben squeezed her hand under the table, a silent reassurance amidst the storm. His touch was a lifeline, grounding her in the present, preventing her from succumbing to the despair threatening to engulf her. Dr. Reed, pale and drawn, offered a fleeting, worried glance from the witness stand. His testimony, a carefully constructed dam against the Blackwood's lies, started to crumble under the relentless onslaught of Mr. Sterling's cross-examination. The weight of Chloe's absence pressed down on Alara with brutal force. The memory of her laughter, her bright smile, was a phantom limb, a constant ache. Each question, each carefully worded lie, felt like another nail in her coffin. The courtroom, a sterile arena of legal battle, felt like a tomb. "Ms. Vance," Mr. Sterling's voice, smooth as polished marble, cut through the silence. "Isn't it true that your accusations are fueled by bitterness, by a desperate attempt to regain something you lost?" Alara felt a cold rage ignite within her, a defiance that momentarily eclipsed her grief. She straightened, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Sterling," Her voice resonated with a quiet strength. My accusations are fueled by the truth, a truth your client has desperately tried to bury. The tension in the room thickened, palpable and suffocating. The judge's sharp eyes swept across the courtroom, a silent warning. But in that moment, in the face of relentless cruelty, Alara found a strength she didn't know she possessed. The fight wasn't just for justice, it was for Chloe, for the life stolen, for the truth that needed to be heard. The battle had only just begun, and she was ready to fight. The weight of grief remained, but it was now intertwined with an unyielding resolve. The fight, though brutal, had become her purpose. The jury's verdict hung in the air, a suffocating silence broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clock. Guilty. The word echoed in Alara's ears, a dull thud against the throbbing in her temples. The courtroom, moments before a maelstrom of tension, now felt eerily empty, the air thick with the residue of raw emotion. Sunlight, slanting through the high windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the stillness. Mr. Sterling, his smugness replaced by a flicker of something akin to surprise, avoided her gaze. Ben's hand, warm and firm, found hers beneath the table. His silent strength was a lifeline, anchoring her to the present amidst the swirling chaos of the past few weeks. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of shared relief and the long road ahead. Outside, the city roared, a jarring contrast to the hushed courtroom. The crisp autumn air, tinged with the scent of damp leaves, did little to soothe the turmoil within her. Dr. Reed, his face etched with exhaustion and relief, approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and cautious optimism. Alara, he began, his voice low and hesitant. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. Sorry isn't enough, doctor, she replied, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. The raw anger, the fierce need for retribution that had fueled her through the trial, had begun to ebb, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. But it's a start. He nodded, understanding dawning in his weary eyes. The Blackwood family's reputation is shattered. The hospital, changes are coming. He paused, searching for the right words. I hope this brings you some peace. Peace. The word felt alien, a distant star in a vast, dark sky. She wasn't sure peace was even possible, not after all she had endured, not after Chloe. The loss still felt raw, a gaping wound refusing to heal. The drive home was a blur, the city lights streaking past like fallen stars. Ben's presence was a silent comfort, his hand resting on her arm, a comforting weight in the silence. He didn't speak, sensing her need for quiet reflection. Arriving at her apartment, the quiet was a balm, a welcome retreat from the maelstrom of the trial. But the silence also held a profound emptiness, a stark reminder of the battles won and the long, slow process of healing that lay ahead. The fight was over, but the scars remained, a testament to the strength she discovered and the journey she would continue to make. The true battle, she realized, was just beginning. The aftermath felt surreal. The city's relentless hum seemed muted, the vibrant colors dulled, replaced by a pervasive gray. Alara stared out her window, the cityscape a blurred canvas of muted tones. The weight of the verdict pressed down, a physical burden. Guilty. The word reverberated not just in her ears, but in the very core of her being. Ben sat beside her, his hand resting gently on hers, a silent anchor in the storm. It's over, Alara, he said softly, his voice a comforting murmur against the city's low thrum. His words, meant to reassure, only amplified the hollowness within her. Over? The legal battle was won, yes, but the emotional war raged on. Chloe's absence was a gaping wound, a constant, throbbing ache. It feels empty, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sirens. She traced the lines etched into the worn wooden surface of her coffee table, her fingertip following the grain, a desperate need for tactile grounding in the overwhelming numbness. Dr. Reed's visit the previous day had offered little solace. His apology, sincere yet inadequate, underscored the chasm between remorse and genuine healing. He spoke of changes at Blackwood, of reforms, of a future where such negligence would hopefully be impossible. But the future felt distant, intangible, lost somewhere in the echoing silence of her apartment. Ben squeezed her hand, his gaze searching hers with an unspoken understanding. "We'll get through this, together," he murmured, his voice firm despite the tremor she detected in his hand. His words were a lifeline, a promise, a reminder that she wasn't alone in navigating this treacherous terrain. The promise felt fragile, yet precious, a flickering candle in the vast darkness. The city lights, once a symbol of urban chaos, now felt like a constellation of tiny, hopeful sparks in the infinite night. The battle was won, but the scars remained. The healing, she knew, would be a long, arduous journey. But with Ben by her side, she wasn't facing it alone. A slow, hesitant smile touched her lips, a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of profound loss. The sentencing felt like a punch to the gut, even though it was the expected outcome. The courtroom, a sterile box of polished wood and hushed whispers, now felt suffocating. Alara's breath hitched in her chest, the air thick with the scent of old paper and fear. She saw Mrs. Blackwood, her face a mask of controlled fury, her eyes burning with a cold fire. The victory felt hollow. Chloe's absence loomed larger than the Blackwoods' defeat. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, the city sounds muted. The silence felt heavy with unspoken grief. Ben's presence was a comfort, his hand warm in hers. "They're appealing," he said, his voice low. The words hung in the air, a renewed threat, a grim reminder that the fight wasn't truly over. Alara looked at her hands, calloused from years of struggling, now trembling slightly. I don't know if I can do this again," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the vast emptiness of her apartment. The city lights blurred through the window panes, a chaotic symphony of distant sounds. Ben tightened his grip. "You've come so far, Alara. You've exposed them, you've fought for justice. Don't let them win again." His words were a lifeline, yet Alara's exhaustion ran deeper than words could express. The physical and emotional toll was staggering. The fight for justice had left her drained and weary. She saw Chloe's face in her mind's eye, young, vibrant, full of life. The image was a sharp contrast to the emptiness she felt. "But at what cost?" she choked out. The question was not just about the ongoing legal battle, but also about her own emotional well-being and the price of her quest for justice. Ben's gaze softened. "Chloe wouldn't want you to give up. She'd want you to keep fighting. For yourself, for everyone they hurt." His words resonated, a reminder that her fight held a significance that transcended her personal suffering. It was about preventing further injustice. It was about giving Chloe's memory a meaning beyond her untimely end. The city noises seemed to fade, the room hushed with the weight of the moment. Alara looked at Ben, his unwavering support a beacon in the storm. The fight wasn't over, but the support she found in Ben gave her the strength to continue, to fight not only for herself, but for Chloe's memory, and for all those whose stories remained untold. The gray of the city outside seemed to lighten, the distant glow of the urban landscape, a promise of a dawn yet to come. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Alara's clothes, a lingering reminder of the courtroom's cold heart. Sunlight, a rare visitor to her apartment, slanted across the worn wooden floorboards, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The silence, once heavy with grief, now felt thin, a fragile piece easily shattered. Ben sat opposite her, a steaming mug of tea warming his hands. He watched her, concern etched on his face. "The appeal. It's expected," he murmured, his voice soft. He knew better than to offer false reassurances. Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the chipped mug in her own hands. The porcelain felt cold against her fingertips. "It's not just the appeal, Ben. It's everything. Chloe's gone. And even if they lose, the Blackwoods, they'll always be there, lurking in the shadows." A shudder ran through her. The fear was a physical presence, a cold knot in her stomach. He reached across the small table, his hand covering hers. His touch was a grounding presence, a silent affirmation of his unwavering support. They've lost their power, Elara. The truth is out. What they did, it can't be undone, but it's been exposed. The words were true, yet the hollow ache in her chest remained. The victory felt incomplete, a fragile victory built on the foundation of loss. The weight of the past, of Chloe's vibrant memory, of her own trauma, pressed down on her. "I'm tired, Ben," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was a profound weariness of spirit. Years of fighting, of battling the immense weight of the Blackwood family's influence, had taken their toll. He squeezed her hand, his empathy radiating through the simple gesture. "Rest, Elara. Let yourself grieve. You deserve it. We'll face the appeal when we have to. But for now, focus on you." He paused, his gaze soft. "You've done more than enough." The unspoken words hung in the air. Asterisk, you've survived. Asterisk, and in that shared silence, in the gentle warmth of his presence, Elara felt a flicker of hope ignite in the ashes of her exhaustion. The city outside hummed a muted rhythm, a stark contrast to the quiet peace within her small apartment. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time since the trial, Elara felt a sliver of respite, a moment to breathe, to heal before the next battle began. The muted hum of the city seeped through the thin walls of Elara's apartment, a counterpoint to the storm raging inside her. The verdict, a Pyrrhic victory, left a bitter taste. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, painted pale stripes across the worn rug, highlighting the dust motes dancing in its beams, a silent testament to her neglect.